all right, when we start to see, all right, things occurring outside the spinal cord. We talked about, with reflexes, about sensory neurons entering into the spinal cord, motor neurons exiting out of the spinal cord and going out to the effector organs, all right? But so let's talk about some of the other things that you might not be familiar with, and that's going to involve what happens to the spinal nerve, all right, when it leaves the actual spine itself. So when it exits from the intervertebral foramen and starts to go to certain parts of your body, all right, we're going to discuss what happens. So the first thing that happens, once the spinal nerve exits out of the intervertebral foramen, it gives off a small branch. All right, and this small branch is called the posterior ramus, okay? And it innervates, all right, deep muscles of the back in the skin on your back, all right? So you need to know, all right? Yes, it innervates muscles, specifically the deep muscles, all right, and the skin of your back. So I'm going to switch to the slide real fast so you can see what I'm talking about here. All right, here's what we're seeing. Here's your spinal nerve. All right, it exits out of the intervertebral foramen. It gives off this small little branch here. All right, and that small branch called the posterior ramus is going to innervate the deep muscles of the back and the skin on your back. Okay, so the next part, well, pretty much what's left over, is what we call the anterior ramus. Okay, and you might hear some other terms being used, like instead of using posterior ramus, you might hear dorsal ramus. Same thing, okay? Anterior ramus and ventral ramus, same thing, all right? So if I accidentally slip and use one of those other terms, just kind of keep in mind, it happens, all right? We're seeing more posterior anterior being used now in the common nomenclature. So the anterior ramus is going to be this larger branch here that's kind of left over. And so we're going to talk about what happens to it, because it's going to form a lot of different branches. And then also off of the spinal nerve, you'll see these two little, smaller branches that come off more towards the front, and those are what we call the rami communicantes, and they're going to contribute to the sympathetic chain, which we labeled. Those are the last two slides that we labeled last week, okay? So the anterior ramus, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about it. But it's these rami, all right, and depends on where they're coming off of. If they're coming off the cervical vertebrae, or not vertebrae, excuse me, the cervical spinal cord, the lumbar and sacral spinal cord, all right, they're going to innervate the other parts that are left over. So what's left over from the back? Well, the anterior part of your trunk, the lateral part of your trunk, and your limbs. So that's what the anterior ramus is going to innervate, all right? Front, side of the trunk, and then your upper and lower extremities, okay? So last week when we were labeling the different types of plexes, all right, remember the cervical plexus and the brachial plexus and the lumbar and sacroplexus, that's what these plexes are made up of the anterior rami. Okay, so these other branches have occurred, all right, and then we have these anterior rami, which are then going to form these plexuses, which we're going to talk about, all right, and how they give off, all right, some of their other branches to make, and eventually we'll wind up with actual named nerves like sciatic nerve, median nerve, musculocutaneous, okay? So those two smaller branches that I was talking about here, whoops, all right, the rami communicantes, these guys here, they're going to actually, all right, be part of the autonomic nervous system, okay? So it's where these little branches here that are going to have, all right, some of our neurons here that are going to enter into and become part of the sympathetic trunk or the sympathetic chain, all right? And so we'll talk about it. Remember, the sympathetic trunk ran parallel to the vertebral column on either side. You're going to have one on the left side, one on the right side. All right, so in this picture that you're seeing here, this is a transverse view. All right, so you're looking up in through the sympathetic trunk. All right, same here. All right, so it's the sympathetic trunk is going into the page and out directly at us because it's running up and down. All right, up and down parallel to the vertebral column here. And then along that way, you'll see all right, sympathetic ganglia. All right, as you know, a ganglia is going to be a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so if you're seeing a clustering of cell bodies, then most likely there's going to be some synapsing going on. All right, so we're going to see, all right, and we'll talk about that in chapter 15. Okay, so keep that in mind, the rami communicantes. All right, so we talked about dermatomes, so I'm just going to kind of move through this part. We already talked about that, which brings me into the nerve plexes. Okay, and so the nerve plexes, there's going to be 4 of them. All right, but pretty much the nerve plexes are going to be made up of the anterior rami, and they're just going to, like I said, they give off branches. Okay, so the anterior rami from C5 and the anterior rami from C6 and C7, they give off branches, and they might fuse together. All right, and they're going to form certain structures that we'll talk about. So our 4 main plexes, which are on both sides, which means you have a left and a right, cervical, brachial, that's going to be going to the upper extremities, lumbar and sacral plexes. Both the lumbar and the sacral plexes will make contributions to the lower extremities too. Okay? All right. So notice we don't have a thoracic plexus, all right? Because the thoracic nerves, all right, the thoracic spinal nerves do not contribute. A few do, but in general, the thoracic spinal nerves do not form plexes. Remember last week we talked about an intercostal nerve? All right, that is an anterior ramus from one of the thoracic spinal nerves. All right, we'll go through some of those. And also, S5 and coccyx or coccygeal 1, all right, also do not form plexes. Okay? So we'll see how some of these, like I said, I know I keep saying it, but these anterior rami, all right, will branch off. And when we go over some of these diagrams here, you'll see how some of them just branch and then branch again and then branch again, which is good because if you damage one of the branches there, or if you damage one of our spinal nerve segments here, all right, it doesn't mean that you're going to lose all the innervation to a specific region because there's other branches from other rami coming to that area there. All right, it's very helpful. Okay. All right, so let's start off by talking about the intercostal nerves, and then we'll start to go into the plexes here. All right. All right. So the intercostal nerves, all right, they're named aptly because they're in between the ribs. All right. And these are going to be specifically the anterior rami from T1, all right, to T11. T12 get its own special nerve or name. It's called the subcostal. All right. So T1 will make some contributions to the brachial plexus. All right. So it does make some contributions. All right. But you will see the anterior ramus. All right. It will go, all right, to the first intercostal space. All right. So therefore, T2 will be found in the second intercostal space. It'll innervate some of the intercostal muscles. Right, and we'll actually get some of the sensory innervation around the armpit there and on the upper portion of the medial portion of your arm, all right, close to the armpit, kind of in between the biceps brachii and the triceps brachii. All right, so that'll be the medial surface there. Okay, so T3 through T6, those are going to, again, innervate your intercostals. And we're going to see how they're going to make up the anterior and lateral chest wall. So swing right up here. Boom. All right, on our dermatome map. You want to see the sensory, whoops. You want to see the sensory innervation. Here you can see it. Okay? So pretty much our intercostals are going to have the segmental, all right, innervation, all right, throughout the thoracic region and the abdominal region. But you can also see how it's going to have, all right, for the thorax, or for T1, all right, it'll actually come down here onto the inside portion of your biceps, all right, down even as far down into the medial portion, all right, of the forearm here, okay? Now, I've seen some thoracic dermatome maps where it has it more on the internal portion here, all right? T2, more towards the armpit. All right, then after that, it becomes pretty easy to decipher, you know, when we're talking about the segmental distribution here of the dermatomes here. All right, gets a little bit crazy when we're dealing with the cervical innervation, all right, and some of the lumbar innervation here, and the sacral innervation. All right, and then for T7 to T12, again, intercostal, but now we're going to include some of the abdominal muscles, all right, rectus abdominis, your obliques, all right, and we'll also see, again, all right, through T7 and T12, it's going to have that kind of ring-like pattern around the abdominal region there, okay? So just take a look, okay? You can see how from T7 all the way down to T12, it's just pretty much that ring pattern around the abdominal area there. Okay, so the intercostals are excuse me, the anterior rami for the thoracic region is not too bad. All right, we're going to get a little bit complicated here when we get into the plexi here. So you can see, all right, here is the spinal nerve. It gives off its posterior ramus here. All right, and then the anterior ramus swings around, all right, and it'll form the intercostal nerve. Now, normally, if you look closely, the intercostal nerve, all right, sits closer to the inferior border of the rib, okay? So if you ever have to stick a needle into somebody's thoracic cavity, all right, say to inflate a lung, drain fluid off of something in the thorax, normally what you will do is you'll palpate the ribs, find the superior border, and then make the puncture in that area. Because it's not shown here in this picture, okay? But on the inferior region too, there's also a vein and an artery, okay? Very small. They all travel together, okay? So if you go in the superior area here, all right, you're not going to damage the nerve and the blood vessels because you're on top of the rib. You go underneath the rib, you're messing with fire. I wouldn't do it. Okay? All right, let's talk about, all right, the cervical plexus here. Okay? Now, remember what I said. The plexi are going to be anterior rami. Okay? So for the cervical plexus, we're dealing with C1 and C4. All right? Now, C5 gives off a few. All right, but it's this cervical plexus which is going to innervate. Remember, if you notice here, face is not mentioned here anywhere. Okay, cervical plexus is going to innervate the anterior neck muscle, so the scalenes. All right, it's also going to innervate, all right, the platysma muscle. We didn't have to label that. Okay, the skin on the neck. All right, and then the tops of your shoulders. All right, and the back portion, all right, or the top portion of your head here. Okay. Now, face is not noted there. I said it in lecture. Do you guys remember which nerve innervates the face? Well, facial nerve innervates the muscles of facial expression. Okay. So I should have been more specific. Yes, you are absolutely correct. Does anybody remember what I said for sensory innervation? Trigeminal. Trigeminal. So trigeminal, right, it's cranial nerve 5. Trigeminal does sensory innervation for the face, and then facial nerve, all right, will do motor innervation. Okay? All right. So we did have to label the phrenic nerve. Okay, that was that little nerve that sat on the anterior scalene. And it's the phrenic nerve that innervates. Oh, it's on there. It innervates the diaphragm. Okay, you should know that. All right, and it gets contributions from C3, C4, and C5. How I remembered it was C3, C4, C5 keeps your diaphragm alive. So, again, if you're going to be going into any type of neurology, it's helpful to know that. So this picture here kind of shows you now, all right, we've got branches. Here's your C1 spinal nerve, all right, coming off, all right, gives you the anterior rami. So C1, C2, C3, and C4 with some branches from C5. And you can just see, point being is, again, and I won't go into all the different parts here, okay, but you can see that the anterior rami give off tons of branches, all right, And some of those branches we give names to. All right, great auricular nerve. All right, this guy here is a really cool structure, the ansa cervicalis, which is this big loop structure that will sit right on the lateral and anterior neck muscles here. All right, and they get different contributions here from C2, C3. All right, it just kind of forms this looping-like structure. Again, it's nothing that you have to know for lab. All right, but understand that all these different branches will come off, combined with branches from other anterior rami, and will eventually form specifically some of our named nerves here. Lesser occipital nerves, the phrenic nerve. All right, so we'll get into more, when I say detail, we'll talk more about some of those named nerves when we get into the brachial and into the lumbar and sacral plexus. All right, brachial plexus is going to get contributions from C5 through T1. Okay, definitely should know that. All right, so this is usually, and especially because you see a lot of disc herniations in the lower portion of the neck, so around C5 and C6, all right, and that can pinch off the C6 nerve, all right, and sometimes C7, and it can cause pain shooting down into the arm, okay? So we'll see, all right, the brachial plexus, these anterior rami, extend from the posterior portion of the neck and even into the armpit here. Now we get into the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus is made up of, it starts off with the anterior rami, all right, which then, all right, will give off branches, and then it will form the trunks, the brachial trunks, which will then form the brachial divisions, chords, and then eventually, all right, those chords will give us the actual named nerves. I can't write. Nerve. I swear to you, I'm not drunk. All right, our named nerves. All right, so like I said, we'll get considerable amounts of branching. All right, so the superior, middle, inferior trunk are going to get contributions. All right, usually for the superior trunk is going to be from the upper portion of the brachial plexus, so that'll usually be C5 and C6. Not to say that C7 doesn't give contributions sometimes, it varies. All right, but for most of the time, it's going to be C5, C6. Middle trunk is pretty much C7, and then inferior trunk is going to be the bottom two, C8 and T1. Remember, cervical spine has 8 spinal nerves. All right, not to be confused with 7 vertebrae. It's the number of bones. Okay. Thoracic gives off 12 spinal nerves. Lumbar gives off 5 spinal nerves. All right, and then the sacrum and the coccygeal area will give off the remaining 6. Okay, so the trunks will divide into the anterior and posterior divisions, which will then, you'll see, all right, when we talk about the anterior, what's clinically significant about the anterior and posterior divisions is when we talk about the parts of the upper extremity to which they innervate. All right, the anterior divisions are going to innervate the anterior portions of your upper extremity. So it'll be the anterior portion of your brachial, all right, which is the arm, and then the anterior portion of your forearm, the antebrachium there, all right. And then after the divisions, we get our chords, all right. Now the chords here, we've got a posterior medial and lateral chord, and these will eventually give us, well, not eventually, but after the chords, that is when we have our named nerves here. All right, so the posterior chord, excuse me, is going to get posterior contribution from the posterior divisions of the upper, middle, and inferior trunks. All right, that means it's going to get contributions from C5 through T1. Medial, all right, is only going to get, it comes off the anterior division of the inferior trunk, so it's only going to get contributions from C8 and T1. And then the lateral chord, anterior divisions of the superior and middle trunk, so it gets C5 through C7. All right, so the final part are going to be, and this is really what I wanted to get down to. Let me kind of show you the brachial plexus first, and I'll come back to that. So you can see here, all right, here are the anterior rami, C5 through T1, okay? And you'll see how it will give off branches here, and they'll combine. So you'll see C5 and C6, all right, will form the superior trunk, All right, C7 pretty much by itself will be the middle trunk, and then C8 and T1 will form the inferior trunk. And then they'll give off branches, right? And then we'll start to form the anterior and posterior divisions, which will give off more branches, right? Which will give contributions to the chords. And then from the chords, we'll get our terminal branches, which are going to be the named nerves. Now, meanwhile, you can get small branches that come off these other segments of the brachial plexus. For example, the long thoracic nerve here, all right? That comes off pretty early on when we're dealing with the anterior rami. In fact, it's the long thoracic nerve that innervates your serratus anterior muscle, okay? And it's this nerve that travels in your armpit. This is the one that is commonly cut during a mastectomy or the removal of any axillary infected lymph nodes. And so we'll see it quite, if it's damaged, then it'll cause winging of the scapula. All right. So the brachial plexus, the terminal branches here, all right, these 5 nerves, axillary, median, musculocutaneous, radial, and ulnar nerves. All right. The axillary nerve, all right, is going to innervate the muscles of the deltoid and teres major muscles. And so for the sensory innervation, it's going to be the upper lateral portion of your arm. Okay, so pretty much right by your deltoid muscle, all right, in the upper portion along where your biceps brachii are. All right, the median nerve, this is an interesting nerve because this is the one that travels in the carpal tunnel. It's the only nerve that travels in the carpal tunnel. This is the nerve when people are complaining of carpal tunnel syndrome, because the carpal tunnel, all right, is this small area at the base of your palm, which the median nerve travels in, and nine tendons travel in. Okay, so it's crowded in there. So those tendons get inflamed, puts pressure on the median nerve, and you can have issues. Well, if you look here, the median nerve is going to innervate your anterior forearm muscles. So those are the flexor muscles of your wrist, okay, and flexors for the fingers. All right, thenar muscles, that's going to be the muscle of your thumb. So if you feel that kind of meaty part at the base of your thumb, those are the thenar muscles. The lateral lumbricals are the muscles that are found in between your fingers that allow you to do this with your fingers. Spread your fingers open. All right, that's what the lateral lumbricals will do. Now, for the sensory input for this nerve, all right, it's going to be, now remember, in the anterior positioning here, it's going to be the palm side, all right, the front of your hand there, all right, and then the back side of your fingers, pretty much through the thumb all the way to half of your ring finger, your 4th digit. Okay? Does not include the pinky. The pinky is going to be the ulnar nerve. Okay? That's the median nerve. So usually when people are complaining of carpal tunnel, they'll complain of weakness for grasping items, and that's because it affects, all right, a lot of these lateral forearm muscles, all right, and muscles that you use to grip, even the thenar muscles here. All right, musculocutaneous nerve, anterior arm muscles. What's that? All right, that's where the biceps brachii are going to be, the brachialis. Okay, so you'll see on the lateral portion of your forearm, you'll get, if this nerve gets damaged, you'll have a deficit in sensory information from the lateral portion of your forearm. All right. Radial nerve is going to be posterior arm muscles, all right, for motor innervation. That's going to be your triceps brachii muscles, and also the posterior forearm muscles. So that means extension of the wrist, of the fingers, of the hand there, okay? And then for the sensory input, it's going to innervate the back portion of your arm and the back portion of your forearm, and then also the back portion of your hand, right, on the lateral side. All right, and then finally, ulnar is going to be the anterior forearm muscles. Those are going to be some of the muscles that are going to help with flexion. All right, intrinsic ham muscles, those are going to be some of the muscles, all right, for finger flexion. And then we'll see for sensory input, it's going to also be on the palm portion, all right, but also the dorsal aspect, which is in the back side of your hand on the medial fingers. What is that? Your pinky and your ring finger. All right, it'll be on the outside, on the back portion there. All right, median does one part of the hand, ulnar does the other part of the hand. Okay, pretty much the median nerve is going to be responsible for the sensory innervation, all right, for your thumb, your pointer finger or index finger, your middle finger, and then half of your ring finger. And then the ulnar will be the remaining part, all right? It'll be the other half of the ring finger and the pinky. All right, so here you can kind of see, all right, the actual nerves themselves. Okay, so as we end up on the terminal branches here, here's your musculocutaneous nerve. That's going to innervate all the muscles of the arm here, the flexor. All right, radial nerve is going to go more posterior. It's on the back side. That's going to innervate the triceps brachii and all the extensor muscles on the back side of your forearm. All right, ulnar you can see on the inside. Remember, it's the ulnar nerve. When you strike this structure here, all right, that's the medial epicondyle, aka the funny bone. So when you hit that, all right, the ulnar nerve goes behind that. That's the nerve that you irritate, and the ulnar nerve stays here on the ulnar side of your forearm, okay, along with the ulnar bone. Okay, median goes straight down the middle, enters in here through the carpal tunnel, and then radial, all right, is going to be found on the lateral portion of your forearm. Then it gives off some branches here, all right, the deep branch, superficial branch, okay. You can see we've got all these smaller branches here. We're not going to worry about that. All right, let's talk about the lumbar plexus, okay. Two more plexes to go, the lumbar and the sacral, okay. The lumbar plexus, all right, comes from the anterior rami of L1 through L4. So the two big nerves that are going to be involved in that are going to be the femoral nerve, which is going to innervate the extensors of your leg, so your anterior thigh muscles, all right, your quadriceps, and sartorius. All right, we saw that sartorius was right there in the medial, the muscle that attaches and crosses over. It's the longest muscle in your body, okay, crosses over from the lateral portion of your thigh and it inserts onto the medial portion of your knee, okay. Sensory input, all right, it receives sensory input from the front of the thigh, and then on the inferior port, the medial lower portion of the inside of your thigh, and the medial, which is the inside portion of your leg, which is your calf, okay? Remember, the thigh is pretty much from your hip to your knee. Your leg is pretty much from your knee to your foot. All right, the other big nerve that comes off the lumbar plexus is the obturator nerve. All right, it is going to actually innervate the medial thigh muscles, so all the adductor muscles, adductor magnus, or part of adductor magnus, I should say. All right, adductor longus, adductor brevis, okay, pectineus, all of those. And so it's going to receive sensory input from the inside of your thigh, but the upper portion. Keep in mind, the obturator nerve comes off of the anterior division of the lumbar plexus. The femoral nerve comes off the posterior division. All right, I'll show you here real quick. Okay, here are the anterior rami, and then they just have it. It's not as complicated as the brachial plexus. All right, we're just dealing here with the anterior rami, and then they form the posterior and the anterior divisions. You can see here the femoral nerve. Right, it's coming off of the posterior divisions of L2 through L4, all right, and then the obturator is coming off the anterior divisions, all right, primarily, all right, L1 and L2 and L3, but it can get contributions from L1. All right, questions about that? All right, last one. Well, let me just show you, well, yeah. Well, if you see here, you can see, again, we don't require you to learn all of the different muscles, okay? Or nerves here, but you can see here's the anterior, or the femoral nerve coming down here. It's going to be innervating all the anterior muscles here, all right? And then you got the obturator nerve coming down here, right, on the medial portion. All right, Sacroplexus, last one. You've probably been waiting this whole time to find out, well, what about the sciatic nerve? Well, here it is. Here's the sciatic nerve, the longest, largest nerve of the body, and it comes off the sacral plexus. The sacral plexus is made up of, right, the anterior rami of L4 through S4. Okay, and we have both an anterior and a posterior division. Okay, this is easy to remember because the anterior division is going to innervate the flexor muscle groups, and the posterior division is going to innervate the extensor muscles. Okay, so our sciatic nerve in this situation is going to get contributions from both the posterior and the anterior. Whoops. Both the posterior and anterior contributions to make up the sciatic nerve. Then our sciatic nerve will split, okay, behind the knee, okay, into the common fibular nerve, all right, and the tibial nerve. Okay, and we'll talk about those individually here. I'll give you a second to write some of that down. Okay, so let me show you the picture here first. Okay, here are all the anterior rami giving their contributions off. All right, blue is going to be the anterior division, but notice how both the posterior divisions and the anterior divisions are going to form the sciatic nerve. Now we have some other smaller nerves here, like the pudendal nerve. That's going to help innervate the floor, the levator ani muscles. All right, for any of you that have ever ridden a bike for an extended period of time, all right, and your butt goes numb, you can thank the pudendal nerve for that, okay, because you've sat on it too long and you caused it to go numb, and then your whole pelvic floor has felt that. All right, but just notice that we get contributions from both for the sciatic nerve from the posterior and anterior divisions here. All right, so tibial nerve. Okay, so when the sciatic nerve splits, it will split it into the tibial nerve and the common fibular nerve, all right? So the tibial nerve is anterior divisions, okay? Common fibular nerve is posterior divisions, okay? So we're going to see, all right, how the anterior is going to innervate, all right, the hamstring muscles, which are flexors, okay? Remember what we said, all right? The anterior divisions are going to have a tendency to innervate the flexors. All right? So it's going to innervate the hamstrings muscles, and all right, the adductor magnus muscle has an actual hamstring part, because if you notice that the adductor magnus was on the posterior portion of the medial or inside of your thigh. All right, and that helps to contribute. All right, mainly its main action is adduction of the thigh, but it also does have a flexor component to it too for the leg. Okay. All right. Then the tibial nerve will split, okay, into the lateral and medial plantar nerves. All right, and they'll go on either side down and innervate the plantar muscles of the foot. That'll be the smaller muscles. We didn't have to identify those in lab, but those are going to be the muscles that are going to help with flexing your toes. Okay. Sensory information is going to be on the bottom of your foot, okay, for the tibial nerve specifically. Common fibular nerve. Remember, posterior division is going to innervate extensor muscles, okay? So here, all right, when we're talking about the common fibular nerve, we're going to see how it's going to innervate the biceps femoris muscle. Remember, biceps, all right, means two heads, so it's going to innervate the short head, all right, of the biceps femoris muscle. And then this nerve, common fibular nerve, splits into its two divisions, all right, the deep fibular and the superficial fibular. All right, and so to finish up here, the deep fibular, all right, will then innervate the anterior leg muscles. That's going to be like tibialis anterior, all right, or flexor digitorum longus, okay, or excuse me, not flexor, extensor digitorum longus. All right, so this is going to innervate the anterior leg muscles and the muscles on the top of your foot. Okay, so if you have extensor digitorum longus in your shin, or on the front of the leg, then you're going to have extensor digitorum brevis on the top of your foot. So the deep fibular nerve is going to innervate that. So the sensory input is going to be on the top of your foot, but only between your first and second toes. All right, I'm going to try this. That's supposed to be the big toe, then your smaller ones. All right, so it's this little bit of skin right here, all right, that it's going to innervate, all right, that kind of like that webbing area, right, in between the first and second toes. Then finally, the superficial fibular nerve is going to innervate the lateral compartment leg muscles. Do you remember the names of those muscles? Remember peroneus, longus, brevis, or fibularis, longus, brevis? Those are the lateral compartment muscles of the leg. So this nerve will also do sensory input for the remaining top portion of the foot and then on the front of your leg. All right, so here, just to kind of show you, all right, all these muscles, not muscles, keep wanting to say muscles, nerves, all right, down here in the lower portion. Sciatic nerve, right, splits into the common fibular nerve and the tibial nerve, all right, and then both of those will split again, all right. The common fibular nerve will split into the deep fibular nerve and the superficial fibular nerve, and they'll just travel down into these areas here, all right, and then the tibial nerve will split into the medial plantar and the lateral plantar nerves. Questions? Probably so many, too many. Lots and lots. Well, not to worry, because now we're going to do some labeling. We'll set our brains into labeling mode here, okay? And we'll go over the spinal cord, the last part of the spinal cord. You know, after this, after the spinal cord, the only thing we have left are going to be the ear and the eye to label. It's crazy. Soon you'll be done with the lab portion of the class, with at least all that information. Then you can start studying it all for the final. Yes. Okay. So without further ado, let's talk about the transverse view of the spinal cord. I've got a couple different models here that I'm going to show it to you first. So we're going to start from the outside and work our way in. Okay. So this first picture here is pointing to the periosteum, and we all know that, all right, as the connective tissue covering to bone. Okay? So it's that gray-like or dark blue region here. Okay? So now we're just going to go from the outside in here. All right? So you can see the periosteum, and then we'll go a little bit deeper, and we're going to point to, all right, that yellowish tissue, which is our epidural fat in the epidural space. Now, please make sure that you read your test question, all right, to determine what it is that it's asking you for. It might ask you for the space. So you would just say the epidural space. What page are y'all on? 42. Okay. All right. But the tissue that's in that space is epidural fat or adipose tissue, okay? Because remember, it plays that role of cushioning, insulation, okay? And you can see all of these blood vessels that are also in there too, all right? So if you damage one of these blood vessels, you'll get an epidural bleed here. All right, so now we're going to see the first layer of the meninges here. That's the dura mater, okay? It's made up of that dense irregular connective tissue, kind of tough, right? Outermost layer for our meninges. And you can see it here, all right, as we follow it down, all right, it covers the anterior and posterior roots, all right, the dorsal root ganglion or the posterior root ganglion. It covers quite a bit all the way out to the spinal nerve. You can't see it in this picture here, all right, but it does travel out quite a ways. All right, the next layer in is the arachnoid mater. That's the middle layer. Okay. So that's just deep to the dura mater. Then we're going to see our first space here. All right, and that space here is the subarachnoid space, and we know what's important about that. That is where our cerebral spinal fluid is going to be circulating. So when they have to take a sample of your cerebral spinal fluid, they got to stick the needle all the way into this space here. All right, and they got to withdraw that cerebral spinal fluid. All right, just deep to that is the pia mater. Pia mater directly lays on top of the nervous tissue of the spinal cord. Okay, so let's talk about white and gray matter. Okay, here's your white matter. Okay, and so here you can see it on this model here. Right, and white matter is made up of what? Right, myelinated axons. Okay. So on the back portion here is what we call the posterior white column. Now I know in lecture I was calling it the funiculus and whatnot, all right? For lab, all right, in your lab manual, all right, this is what we're going to be using here as our terms. Okay, posterior white column. All right, let's look at the other model. There it is on the other model, posterior white column. All right, then we have the lateral white column right there. Keep in mind, the posterior white column is made up of only sensory axons. Right, but the lateral white column is mixed. We'll have sensory, we'll have motor, which means we'll have ascending pathways and descending pathways. All right, and then finally, on the front portion, we'll have the anterior white column. Bless you. Here you can see it on that model, anterior white column. Okay, so that's it for the white matter. So let's talk about the gray matter here. All right, so the gray matter also, now you can interchange, you can use either or. I put both up here. You can either call it the dorsal gray horn or the posterior gray horn. All right, more people refer to it as the posterior gray horn. Okay, posterior gray horn is this back portion here. All right, that is where you get sensory neurons entering in, okay, from both the somatic sensory nervous system and the autonomic or visceral sensory nervous system. All right, that's what we'll see, all right, the cell bodies of the inner neurons there. All right. Then you can see here the lateral gray horn. Lateral gray horn is where we're going to see the cell bodies, all right, for the neurons that are going to be a part of the visceral or autonomic motor nervous system. Which means that those neurons are going to innervate, all right, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Here you can see it on the other model. All right, that's the lateral gray horn. All right, and then finally, we have the anterior or ventral gray horn, okay? And this will contain the cell bodies, the lower motor neurons, which are going to innervate skeletal muscle, somatic motor neurons. All right. Here it is on this model here. Okay, so at the center of our spinal cord, you got a hole there. That's the central canal. That's where we find cerebral spinal fluid. And here it is on the other model. All right, so where we see, all right, that crossing over of gray matter from one side to the other, that's called the gray commissure. Okay, that'll be unmyelinated axons that'll travel over there. Gray commissure on this model, gray commissure on that model. All right, then we got a couple other structures that I want to point out to you folks. All right, in the front here, you can see this indentation, and that's going to be the anterior median fissure. Okay, anterior median fissure. Then we can see it over here too. Anterior median fissure. All right, so that's on the anterior or ventral portion of the spinal cord. Now we go to the back portion. And you can see here we have our posterior median sulcus. And we can see it on this one too. There's the posterior median sulcus on this other model. All right, so now we're going to move a little bit away from the spinal cord proper and talk about some of the structures that are close by. First one that we're going to talk about, okay, is our dorsal root or posterior root ganglion. That kind of like swelling that you're seeing here. You can see it over here too, but it's gray here. That's because the dura mater is kind of covering that. All right. That's where the cell bodies of your primary sensory neuron are going to be located. Okay. Remember, they're unipolar. All right. Posterior or dorsal root ganglia. What's a ganglia in the peripheral nervous system? Well, you're thinking of gray matter. The ganglion is going to be a group of cell bodies. Yeah, yeah. And we call that same thing in the central nervous system a nucleus. Okay. So here you can see the dorsal or posterior root ganglia in this other model. It's much easier to see here. Not super excited about this next model picture here, but nonetheless, I need to show you. All right, so just distal from the dorsal root or posterior root ganglion, you have this little area here. This is the spinal nerve. Okay, it's before any branches come off here. All right, there's a branch here, and then another branch here, and some more branches here. All right, so where that circle is, that's the spinal nerve. Now you can see it better in this other model. Usually when I do an in-class test, this is the model I prefer to use. Okay, so the spinal nerve is a mixed nerve, which means it contains sensory neurons and motor neurons. Sensory neurons carry information to the central nervous system. Motor neurons carry information away from the central nervous system. All right, it's a bidirectional highway. All right, so information comes in, information leaves. Okay, so it's coming in and out. Okay. So the area here that just has primarily sensory information is going to be the dorsal root. all right, of the spinal nerve or the sensory root of the spinal nerve. Either or is acceptable, okay? So these little things right here, okay, that's going to carry sensory information into the spinal cord. All right, dorsal root of the spinal nerve, or sensory root of the spinal nerve. You can see it here on this model. All right, and then this other slide has the ventral root or the motor root of the spinal nerve. All right, and that's going to carry motor input, or excuse me, output, I should say. All right, you can see it on this model here. Okay, and then we just learned this today. All right, the spinal nerve, as it leaves the the vertebral column, it through the intervertebral foramen. Almost forgot what I was trying to say. Intervertebral foramen. It gives off a branch. The first branch that it gives off that goes up towards the back is the dorsal ramus, also known as the posterior ramus. Okay. And that little branch, it's a small branch, is going to innervate the skin on your back and the deep muscles of your back. Okay. Then you can see, all right, these two little branches that are going to come off the front, and we call, whoops, wait, hold on, back up. All right, so we got the dorsal ramus. Then you've got the ventral ramus or the anterior ramus. Now, I should tell you guys this. If you want to, all right, when you're taking your test, instead of writing ventral, you can write anterior, all right? And same thing here when you're, instead of dorsal, all right, you can write posterior. All right, and that includes for this stuff here too, okay? Like dorsal root, you want to do posterior root, it's fine, okay? Same thing like ventral root, all right? You can write anterior root, okay? You can interchange ventral and anterior and dorsal and posterior, all right? All right, so after that, you see these two little branches that come off the front, and those are known as the either ramus communicans or rami communicantes. Either or is fine. And these little guys carry, we'll talk more about this when we get into chapter 15. All right, but these little guys carry autonomic nervous system, all right, neurons. And finally, the last one here is this is the sympathetic trunk or the sympathetic chain. Remember, we saw last week the anterior posterior view, so we saw it running up and down. This is a transverse one, so we've just cut into it. But it's the rami communicantes that will connect the sympathetic trunk to the spinal nerve. Any questions? That's it for the spinal cord. We done. No questions? Alrighty then. Well, I guess I'll let you guys